And so hello and welcome everybody to our 30-second inspiration exchange. My name is Fergus Imrie and I'm a postdoc in the Schaar Lab, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today for our session on personalized monitoring. Before we jump into our session, we're very excited as a lab about NeurIPS coming up next week, where a large number of members from our lab will be there presenting various papers, as well as hosting a workshop on synthetic data and a tutorial on data-centric AI, for which we'll be previewing a part of later on after today's inspiration exchange session. So please do stick around if you're interested in catching some of that. And please do come and chat to us at NeurIPS. We would be delighted to meet as many of you as possible. To that end, especially if you are considering applying for a PhD position and haven't done so yet, we're still recruiting for next year, but it's getting definitely later now. So if you're interested in applying, we really urge you to do so as soon as possible. So back to today's session. So in the first part of today's session, you'll hear first from Professor Mihaela, who's going to give a bit of an overview and introduction into personalized monitoring. And then you'll hear from two of our PhD students, Sam Holt and Yuchao, about two topics about personalized monitoring. In the second half of the session, we'll then go into a roundtable discussion with our two guests, Dr. Bill Weeks and Professor Eoin McKinney, who I'll introduce more formally later on in the session. And then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers or either of our panelists, please put your questions in the Slack channel that we'll post the link to in the chat now, and we'll try and take as many of them as we can later on in the session. Without any further ado, though, I'd like to hand over to Professor van der Schaar for her overview and introduction.
I'm very excited about the session of today because it's such an important area and yet very overlooked in the area of AI and machine learning. So first, let me remind you that at the beginning of this fall, we started to really talk about the need to have a fundamentally new paradigm for AI, to have it solve real-world complex problems, whether it's in medicine or other areas. And we put a manifesto paper on our website, which we call the Case for Reality-Centric AI. And we really argued for the need of reorienting the way we look at solving problems using machine learning and AI to really address some of the key challenges that different applications and domains pose. And today's session is very much an example of this type. This manifesto paper contained multiple research pillars, and one of the prominent ones was pillar number 2, where we argued that machine learning models must be designed to operate with real-world data. And this is true for no matter what application you are having in mind. And when we mentioned real-world data, we thought about complex, messy, multidimensional, multimodal real-world data, but also unfair data, noisy data, erroneous data, missing data, limited or no data, or data that cannot be exchanged easily due to privacy considerations. And over the last 2 sessions of Inspiration Exchange, we have discussed about these topics, and I hope that you will take a look at them if you have not been as part of the session. But there are 2 important considerations of real-world data that we talk the least of, in my opinion. And that is costly data and evolving data. And just to anchor the machine learners in the room into a few examples, and I'm sure many more will come from Bill and Eoin later in the session. For instance, if it is to consider healthcare data, this data is not available in a data set usually, the way we think in machine learning. But it is data that is acquired at a cost, both monetary cost, but also patient cost, as a clinician, for instance, is seeing a patient and needs to diagnose them. Then a variety of tests and questions and information may be acquired about this particular patient. For instance, the clinician may do a blood test followed by imaging. And the question may be, what type of imaging should the clinician adopt to gather the right information about this patient? So data is not there as we often in machine learning expect in a standardized data set in front of us, but rather is acquired through a very judicious process. And what data is acquired and what data it is not acquired is part of the decision-making process of the person acquiring this data, for instance, the clinician on behalf of their patients. So the data is costly both in terms of monetary cost, but also difficult to acquire in certain settings because of negative impact on the person from which this data is acquired. Also, I talk here about medicine, but I would be very keen to hear from the participants about other domains in engineering or other areas where there are costs associated with energy of collecting the data, measurement costs, but also potentially environmental costs. And why not? Cost of establishing the infrastructure to collect a particular type of data. So what I'm very excited about the session today is to talk to you about an area that in our lab over the last decade we have been looking at with different types of techniques, but the two methods you are going to hear today from Sam and Yuchao are especially interesting and cutting edge. But I'd like to excite everyone in the room, especially the machine learners, to start to look at this often overlooked problem of data acquisition, judicious data acquisition, and see it as an interesting and yet not completely solved problem in machine learning. So with this in mind, I'd like to again ask you all to engage with reality-centric AI and machine learning, which requires new ways of thinking about real-world problems like the one we are going to discuss today. Thank you.
I'm Sam Holt, and this is Active Observing and Continuous Time Control. This is joint work with my excellent co-author, Alihan, and my supervisor, Mihaela. So what is Active Observing in Continuous Time Control with observation costs? And actually, this is a real-world setting that we first formally in this paper. We prove a theoretical property for it and also propose an initial method. However, let's look at the applications where this could be most useful in the real world. So medical settings, particularly such medical settings as cancer chemotherapy treatment, taking expensive scans such as computed tomography scans to image the volume or diameter of cancer whilst continuously controlling chemotherapy dosing is a real-world applicable problem. Other real-world applicable problems consider such problems of mobile robotics, where we need to measure a robot's position, which is a costly observation, whilst continuously controlling the robot. Low power communication, where we might need to measure the maximum bandwidth, whilst continually controlling the channel transmission. And also biological fish population management or biological species management, where actually performing a survey to observe the population of a species is expensive, and we want to continuously control the food or temperature. So what is continuous time control with costly observations? Formally, this is a continuous time environment which is described mostly by a differential equation of an underlying system. And we assume that we observe an observation based on this system when we take a costly observation, coupled with some sort of noise, as we see here. Now, what's interesting is in most real-world applications, it's very expensive or not feasible to interact with an online environment, such as a medical environment. So in a lot of applications, we have log data sets of previous interactions with the environment, such as medical settings, which we wish to learn a dynamics model or offline model with. So in this case, we formalize and analyze this problem for offline reinforcement learning environments. And in this case, because it's a continuous time environment, we often get observations of trajectories of actions and also the state, the medical state in this case, observed at irregular time intervals. Most commonly, actually, in this case, instead of the typical RL setting, we have to pay observation costs to observe the state. And this really comes down to Overall, we want to maximize this new metric of utility, which is maximizing the reward over the episode and also minimizing the number of observations that we take as they're costly. So we do this by formally splitting up the policy that determines when to schedule the next costly observation, whilst also splitting up the policy represented pi here, which is the policy for controlling the continuous actions in the continuous time environment. And this can be formalized as we schedule the next observation with a planning policy rho. We then execute continuous actions up to this next observation, and then we take the next observation and repeat this process until the episode is solved. And what we're wanting to do here, we want to work out the optimal policies that maximize this utility for these environments. So we're the first to formalize the problem of continuous time control whilst deciding when to take costly observations. So theoretically, we show that regular observing continuous time with costly observations is not optimal for some systems, and that irregularly observing can achieve a higher expected utility. And we formally prove this in the paper, which we encourage you to check out. Overall, our method, which we call active observing control, is a continuous time model-based offline RL method that uses a heuristic threshold on the variance of reward rollouts in a model predictive control planner. This has the immediate benefits that it can avoid discretization errors in time. We can learn from an offline data set sampled with irregular time intervals and observation costs. We can achieve high-performing utility compared to existing methods, and we allow only to observe when it's informative to do so, and hence observe irregularly in time, which we formally prove is more optimal and is robust to heuristic threshold hyperparameter and has a small runtime complexity, so it's practical to use with existing systems. So let's analyze how this works in detail. So we have an environment. In this case, we take a first costly observation, and what we're looking to do is then plan an action trajectory of how we can somewhat optimally control this environment. And in this case, we use an offline model-based predictive control planner from a offline dynamics model that we've learned previously. Now, this dynamics model, we only really assume that it needs a probabilistic estimate of the future predicted time points given some sort of continuous action trajectory. And we empirically do this by training a deep ensemble of neural networks with continuous time input parameter, and we use an iterative Monte Carlo estimate to work out the, using model predictive control, to optimally work out a continuous time action trajectory, which we can follow. However, the next question is, how long should we follow this continuous time action trajectory up until we take the next observation out? We can determine this by forward estimating using a particle estimate of the possible states that we would end up, and a probabilistic estimate using our probabilistic continuous time dynamics model. And based on this and our reward model, which can be either given or learned, we can then estimate the variance of the predicted reward rollouts. And therefore, using this simple initial method of using a threshold on this heuristic, we can see when a set threshold crosses a certain uncertainty, which we can then determine when to take the next observation at. Hence, giving our scheduling policy rho to determine when to determine the next observation at, and then we can follow the action trajectory up until this time point, at which point we take another costly observation. And hence, we really want to maximize, in this case, we want to work out when to take the next costly observation. Of course, this is a continuous time model with a continuous action trajectory. So therefore, we follow this by binary search to work out exactly when that threshold crosses. And this really avoids time discretization errors, which can compound in existing methods, and we see this in the existing baselines. So how do we do when we look at, say, treating a simulated cancer in a synthetic environment with costly observations, and also robotics physical simulators where there's also costly observations? We can achieve state-of-the-art utility performance, which is normalized between a random policy and a almost perfect policy, which takes many observations. And we can actually achieve better performance than the existing methods of discretization planning and monitoring and continuous time planning methods. And really, this comes down to we can achieve narrow expert policy performance because we can take observations when they're more informative to do so, rather than taking less informative observations. So if we look at existing baselines, such as continuous planning, so you might ask, how do we achieve higher expected utility than regular observing? Now, we can actually, what's really interesting is our method, active observing control, automatically determines to observe large cancer volumes more frequently as they're more informative, as the future state change magnitude is larger. And this actually correlates to what clinicians observe, that the sample or image a cancer volume of a larger volume more frequently than existing methods, and actually this correlates here. So actually, it's more optimal to observe, especially with costly observations, with irregular time intervals, and they can dynamically adapt to the underlying dynamics of the system, as we see here, compared to continuous planning, which takes many regular spaced observations, which are actually often wasteful and expensive, of course. So we can also see this for other environments as well, such as a pendulum swing up environment. We have a pendulum and we wish to swing it upwards. We also observe the irregular observing in time. And when we compare it with continuous time planning, and we kind of ablate or force continuous time planning to take the same number of observations, we can actually see that active observing control can take observations in continuous time more informatively as they're better well located, therefore actually achieving higher utility overall. And one might ask, why the interest in continuous time models, and especially this method? Actually, if we look at existing discretization monitoring methods, with such a method, with some sort of discretization interval has to be tuned, and in this case, it can actually miss a critical test, such as imaging a cancer by potentially over a day, which could be somewhat fatal in a medical setting. Whereas as soon as we cross it with a continuous time method, we can then actually force to then take another observation and also correct the action control, leading to a better outcome. So the contributions of this work were forced first to formalize the problem of continuous time control whilst deciding when to take costly observations. We can achieve state-of-the-art utility performance. We can correctly observe the state when it is informative to do so, and we can avoid discretization errors in time, and it's robust to the threshold parameter. Now, this really enables dynamic, expensive medical scan scheduling, and we now have a new improved method to build on and solve this real-world applicable costly observing whilst continually controlling the problem. I'm excited to see what you do with this paper, and feel free to check the work out here. Thank you.
Many thanks to Sam for the detailed introduction to the sensing problem. So I don't need to spend too much time on that. And I will keep more focus on the problem we are going to try to address in our practical settings. Okay, so my name is Yuchao, and next I'm going to introduce the latest work on active sensing for timely disease diagnosis under cost pressure. And this is a joint work with my supervisor, Professor Mihaela van der Schaar, and Professor Chang-Hee Lee, who is a former PhD student of our lab. So in healthcare, the timely follow-up of disease progression is really crucial for the early interventions. We consider the discrete follow-ups arranged during this process as the output of the sensing task. And these longitudinal measurements of patient covariates should be properly arranged such that the underlying disease progression can be accurately tracked over time. And generally, the timely disease diagnosis relies on the repeated observation of some key risk factors, like to determine the disease stage of maybe the Alzheimer's disease, we need some expensive medical imaging like PET scan, etc., which may come with high expense and potentially harmful radiations. So we know that, however, we know that these expensive measurements are not always necessary to the patient, especially when the patient is in a very relatively stable health condition. So for the better cost efficiency of the sensing process, the active sensing problem focuses on the negotiation between the measurement cost and the diagnosis accuracy for the individual patients. A desirable sensing strategy should only measure the patient covariates that are informative of the disease progression, and such that we can maintain a reasonable acquisition expense throughout the entire sensing process. Well, this problem has been extensively studied in the literature, but there are still two outstanding challenges in practical sensing scenarios. The first challenge comes from the follow-up intervals. Like in practice, for patients at different disease stages, usually different follow-up intervals are preferred based on the urgency to measure new patient covariates or determine whether or not to perform intervention to the patient. And the second challenge comes from the patient heterogeneity. Conventional active sensing approaches generally optimize the sensing performance averaged over the entire population. However, in many cases, the high-risk patients only take up a small proportion of the population and can easily suffer from poor diagnosis accuracy due to the data imbalance issue. Then the immediate question is, how can we resolve these challenges? Firstly, for the arrangement of the patient follow-ups, instead of manually setting a small and constant decision interval, we generally prefer to learn the follow-up intervals dynamically from the data available. And to deal with the biases caused by patient heterogeneity, we propose to optimize the sensing policy against the patient subset affected by the potentially biased policy instead of average them over the entire population. And in summary, we propose a novel risk-averse active sensing approach, which we call RAS, such that we can achieve risk-averse active sensing. Generally, we factorize the sensing firstly, to deal with the adaptive follow-up interval, we factorize the sensing policy into two orthogonal sub-policies and achieve the natural decomposition of the decisions on both feature selection and the follow-up scheduling. And to deal with the patient heterogeneity, we propose a measurement for the sensing performance for individual patients as a weighted sum of the measurement cost and diagnosis error. And based on such a linear trade-off between the two essential parts, we formulate the active sensing task into a risk-averse optimization problem and optimize our RAS policies dynamically to minimize the potential sensing failures for patient subsets affected by the potential biased policy. And this is achieved by optimizing our conditional value at risk objective as shown on the left side. To evaluate the effectiveness of our method, we benchmark our method RAS with 4 baselines on the real-world healthcare dataset, and we show that our method can effectively achieve cost-efficient sensing on the NA dataset by minimizing the loss in diagnosis accuracy while reducing the sensing cost compared to other baseline approaches. And further, we illustrate that our proposed method can actually improve the worst-case sensing performance and reduce the potential chances of sensing failures compared to the two risk-neutral ablations. Finally, many thanks to the CS Trust for supporting our research, and thank all co-authors for their contributions. And if you are interested in more works on the active sensing, you're welcome to check our dedicated web pages. Thanks.
So we're now going to move towards move into the second part of our session and our panel discussion with our two guests. And so I'm delighted to introduce you more formally to these two guests. Our first guest is Dr. Bill Weeks, who is the director of the AI for Health Research program at Microsoft and is a physician economist who leads all of Microsoft's AI for health effort. I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Eoin McKinney from the University of Cambridge, who is a professor of renal medicine and affiliated with the Cambridge Centre for AI in Medicine. I'm going to let Sam kick us off with a question for Bill and Eoin relating to some of the topics we've discussed today on personalized monitoring. So Sam, do you want to kick us off with a question for our panelists?
Great. Yep. Hi. Great to meet you both. Yep. So in your experience, what are the key factors that should guide the decision of when to make costly observations in a healthcare setting?
Can you say when to make what kind of observations? Continuous?
Costly observations, like things that are quite expensive to do, like a CT scan.
Okay. Yeah.
How would you essentially what factors guide your decision of when you would make such a costly observation? Because obviously, if it's quite costly, it's not so easy to do, or maybe limited resources settings too.
Yeah, so if you want me to start, so I would consider, as an economist, resources are limited. You want to use those resources to their best use to have kind of optimize patient outcomes, not only at the individual level, but at the population level, right? Taking a resource away from someone could harm someone else. So I think understanding the disease process and what it is you're trying to do is critical, and it will probably be, frankly, a measure by measure and patient by patient kind of decision around that. I think as physicians, we do this all the time, right? We should do this all the time. I'm not sure we do. I know we don't in the US healthcare system, but we should say, does this patient really need an MRI? Is it going to change, right, the trajectory of their care? Because if it isn't going to do that, if it's not going to have an impact on kind of care provided in the future, it would be defined as waste, right? We're just doing it to do it. And sure, it'll generate revenues and it might, increase someone's ability to read an X-ray or something like that. But it's not going to do anything for the things we should optimize: patient care and population health.
Could I jump in there, Bill, and maybe ask both you and Eoin to a follow-up question? So do you consider when making this, do you feel that there is a possibility for AI to help the decision-making process, especially in settings where there may be, like you say, an entire trajectory of potentially follow-up information that may be needed to debug something with the patient? Or do you feel that AI can play a role, and what type of role? And I'd be keen to hear from both of you more about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, from my perspective, absolutely. I think there's this thing called the clinical cascade that happens when you take a test, when you do a test, right? And we know this statistically. You do a test, they're designed, the parameters are designed with about a 95% confidence interval, meaning that if you do 20 tests, you're going to find one that's wrong, right? Statistically on a patient. So the question is, do you follow up on that, right? And the follow-up can cause all sorts of problems, huge costs, actually, if you do biopsies, it can put patients at risk and expose them to unnecessary risk, and again, reallocate resources inefficiently. So can AI kind of help articulate what those downstream costs might be from pursuing something that has a very low likelihood of having any kind of meaningful impact? And absolutely, I think it can happen. I think doctors who are very, very busy will often just need, from a kind of a legal perspective, to follow up. I need to follow up on this because if I don't, I could get sued and something bad might happen. I think to couch that decision more in a probabilistic term of it's exceedingly, the patient will have more risk of getting in a car accident driving over here to get the additional testing than anything we might get from the test would be very valuable to know. And we should use that when communicating with patients as well, saying that we could do this follow-up. It's exceedingly unlikely to have anything to do with you, with your care and your outcomes. And so let's maybe not, and engage the patient in that discussion.
I'd echo that. The question we always ask ourselves before we do any investigation, or we should, is whether it's going to change the management. So is it going to inform or alter what I do now? And sometimes the answer to that question is no. If I scan a 95-year-old woman and find a cancer that's not going to be operable or treatable anyway, should I really be doing the scan in the first place? Perhaps not. And those are decisions we have to make before we order or instigate any investigative process. I think in answer to your question, Mihaela, could AI contribute to this? Unquestionably, yes, because we do this on the basis of gut instinct as clinicians. the simplest thing of when should I see you again? And Mihaela, you sort of alluded to a hierarchy of investigation. That's absolutely right. The first one is, when should I see you again? When do I think your disease behavior might have changed, progressed, or when I might need to review that? Let's say I see you in a couple of months. Then I'll repeat some tests as a routine, as monitoring. And then some of those can cascade, because every test has a false positive and a false negative rate. So as you say, some of those can get chased. But those are currently based on very broad instincts and clinical experience. We don't base that at an individual level, and it's not a quantitative science. I'll see you in a few months because we know that someone for your approximate stage of disease, the progression varies or evolves over that sort of time period.
But I'd be curious to ask you something more about that. So it seems like almost you allude that we should gather information not only to find the ultimate label, we would call it in machine learning, the ultimate diagnose, but rather maybe not to pursue the ultimate diagnose necessarily, but to pursue the ultimate intervention, which is really something quite different for us, I think, machine learners, because we often think about pursuing information to assign a label. But what you are saying a little bit, if I understand you correctly, both the two of you, is to pursue information to determine the right interventions. Even the exact label may not be there. Is that making sense as well?
It is, and it's probably more important, because in medicine, the proportion of conditions we cure is tiny. Few infections, most other things are chronic diseases. Once you have your diagnostic label, it sticks with you and you usually carry it. Even if it's a relapsing condition that never comes back, you still have the potential for relapse, so we still monitor it. So absolutely, once you have the diagnostic label, that's the start, not the end. And then there's a whole monitoring process that requires estimating when your disease is likely to alter its trajectory, when you might need consideration of different treatments. And one other little thing I'd say is we've talked quite a bit about the cost, and cost means many things to many people. There's the financial cost of doing something. There's the cost to the patient in terms of potential side effects of any intervention or off-target effects of any drug. There's also the cost of being wrong, and that varies a lot as well by condition and influences the frequency with which we might monitor. So if there's a small chance of something happening, I may be more likely to monitor for that. If the clinical impact of that event is huge, if it's death or recurrence of cancer, for example, I'm much more likely to monitor for it, even if the risk is comparatively low. So the cost has different angles to it.
But
I think I'll just add on to Ian's comments is that there is a recall heuristic too, right? So if a doctor just had a bad experience with a patient, that something they missed or something was out, they will statistically more likely test for that stuff in the future, right? Whether it has any value going forward or not. So I think what AI can do is provide some objectivity that maybe when we get emotionally involved with our patients, we care. I mean, the reason we went into this stuff is because we care about people. That matters. And so we don't want to make the same mistake again, right? But AI can really provide, again, some objectivity. I would also just want to comment on something that I worked at Dartmouth Medical School for many years before joining Microsoft. And there is the concern about overdiagnosis and what does early diagnosis really get you? And I think Eoin was kind of making some of this comment. If it doesn't change your survival length, it's not clear what you've done other than burden a patient with a new diagnosis and worries and sleepless nights, right? So I think when we think often about early diagnosis, particularly in a non-clinical way, and even clinicians think about this, we think that, we'll diagnose it earlier and we'll be able to intervene and the bad stuff won't happen, which is true some of the time, but some of the time that is not the case. You simply extend the length of time that someone has a diagnosis. And the survival rates really, you just kind of, the true survival rates don't change. The patient still dies at age 86. They just have the diagnosis for longer. So I would really recommend, if you're interested in reading about that, there's a guy, Gil Welch, who was one of my mentors, H.G. Welch, who has written extensively on this, including a couple of books.
Fergus, sorry for derailing a little bit. I have one more follow-up question. I really am keen to ask both of them. So us as machine learners, often we would like to estimate these costs, or we would like to know these costs. You know, we can formalize the type of problems that Sam and Yuchao have shown as a trade-off between the informational gains, if you like, in terms of diagnosis or treatment, but also costs. And often, if I understand correctly, these costs may not be necessarily known, may themselves be a machine learning problem. So estimating, for instance, a monetary cost may not be something that a machine learner that may be known, but for instance, the cost of misdiagnose or false diagnose or is something I guess that can be estimated. So I'd be keen, number one, to ask you about these costs. Are they known? Do they need to be estimated from data? Can machine learning help? That's number one. And number two, to what Bill just said, which I thought was fascinating, about the fact that the clinicians themselves, because of maybe a misdiagnosis, may change their practice. This, of course, confounds the data. The data itself is somewhat biased and confounding, and we machine learners often learn from this data and propagate such biases. So do you have some thoughts about these two questions to help us and guide us?
Yeah, sure. So can costs be quantified? I think most of the cost can be quantified. The financial cost of an investigation be quantified. The risk of getting it wrong can be quantified. The false positive, false negative, the accuracy of the test can be quantified. The impact on the individual, I think, is harder to quantify, but can be set to one side slightly, because if you can factor in all the other costs, then you can tell an individual what the optimal timing of an investigation might be, and then they can then make the final decision comes down to the individual as to whether or not they would want it, given those costs, given that balance. That sort of comes to the point of not everyone would want to know. In a certain situation, some people would certainly want to know, some people wouldn't want to know at all. They don't want that information, and that's an individual thing that's not predictable, I think. But setting that aside, the rest of it, I think, is quantifiable and useful. What would you say, Bo?
I totally agree. I think a bunch of them, particularly if you're based on billing kinds of things, that's kind of quantifiable. You can look at out-of-pocket costs, that's quantifiable. I think things that maybe need to be more incorporated, if we think about the quadruple aim, which is how I always think about stuff: patient experience, provider experience, outcomes, and then all that divided by costs. One cost is patient worry. If you do these diagnoses in these workups, there is this thing they've even called it sleepless nights, right? Patients who have sleepless nights. So this can cause people to make crazy decisions. Indeed, a weird thing that happened in Texas a long time ago, when they decided they were going to test everyone getting married for HIV, for AIDS, right? So it was the least likely population probably be exposed to AIDS at the time. And so the false positives were going to be off the charts. And the concern was that would stop this from happening was that people might get this diagnosis, a false positive, and suicide or something horrible, right? Take action on what is kind of incorrect. So some of these costs need to be kind of considered. I think social costs almost need to be considered and maybe even prioritized over some of the true costs. But I totally agree with you, Ian, too, that if patients don't want to know this, or your 95-year-old woman doesn't want the MRI because she's good, and we're not going to do anything about it anyway, we shouldn't. Frankly, I think that's called feudal medicine. We shouldn't even offer it in certain cases, right?
I guess quantifying when it's futile is the challenge up front. From an ML perspective, because that is very individual and I think harder to predict. So you almost have to segregate that from any quantitative assessment of what you should do and when.
Actually, machine learning could help with that. A current student of ours, Alihan Huyuk, did some interesting work where he's trying to learn the preferences of patients from data, with the overall goal of trying to really present that to patients themselves to see if indeed they find themselves into it. So machine learning for learning preferences, I guess. Fergus, sorry, back to you. Sorry for the intermezzo.
Do not worry. I think that stimulated some fantastic discussion on these super tricky points, but that are going to be crucial to get right for this kind of work to have an impact. Yuchao, I wondered if you had a question that you wanted to ask either Eoin or Bill. You're muted, I think.
Yes, thanks. But I guess my question is sort of covered by the previous discussion, but maybe the two guests may want to further extend their answer or discussion about that. So my question is that what kinds of insights clinicians would prefer or would like to get from an active sensing strategy, such that they can make more informed decisions regarding their screening to their patient or their follow-ups to their patients. Like conventionally, we can use maybe something like feature selection to tell clinicians what features are important. And now with our method, with Sam and my method, we are able to tell suggest clinicians when it is most maybe valuable or most relevant for clinicians to make a new follow-up. But would there be some additional information be wanted, or could we do something further in that direction?
I mean, yeah, for me, I think that that interpretable AI is really important for clinicians we all go through this very long pathway of learning, the physiological and pathobiological basis of disease. And so there is a logic to it. And so if something comes to us and says, do this, it's not something we're going to embrace kind of very easily, I think. But I think articulating what is it that the model is primarily based on, so the features that are primarily driving model outcomes, and even reducing the model complexity to those key factors is really helpful because it can make sense to providers. And then for me, I think again, moving away from a kind of yes, no, do this or don't do that to a probability kind of framework is helpful. So that, again, because again, at Dartmouth, we did a lot of shared decision-making, informed decision-making. And the thought being that we clinicians, we co-produce health with a patient as a partner. We don't just tell them to do stuff, because frankly, they don't do it anyway. If we just tell them, only maybe if they're engaged do they actually kind of take the meds on time and do what we recommended. So to engage them by using data, and maybe to Mihaela's point is to also say, and Eoin's point, also say, here's for the overall patient, here's for someone like you, what the anticipated outcomes might be. And just understanding that dynamic may get to the solution of what's futility, right? For the general population, this works half the time. For someone with your characteristics, it works 2% of the time. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about whether that's a reasonable path forward. I think those would be very useful in engaging clinicians in that dynamic with the patient to co-produce health.
Yeah, thanks.
Yuchao, if I could give you a specific example, I would say that the low-hanging fruit here, where you could make an impactful intervention very quickly, is with the currently extremely crude estimates of when I should see my patient again. Now, we routinely just put everyone on a similar cycle. Some are further apart than others. Most we just see on a regular basis. And that's not in any way estimated on the basis of any future endpoint risk. It's clinical estimate, literally, I guess. You could make a huge impact and a quantifiable impact on resources. All of our clinics are stuffed full. We don't have enough slots to see patients as frequently. That's a huge and very easily quantifiable cost. So sensing when we should see people again would be one way to very quickly implement the sort of tools that you're describing in real world practice. Perhaps it's not as simple a process as it might sound, because we're talking about goal-directed estimation. So when should I scan again? That's a single intervention at a single time point, whereas the estimate for when I would see someone again might take into account potential side effects from medications, new medications they might require, disease that might progress. So there might be multiple things that go into that decision process. So it may be that estimating it requires integration of multiple endpoints. So active sensing across a horizon of multiple possible endpoints rather than just a single one, and trading off benefits and costs of each of those together in some sort of ensemble fashion.
From a methods point of view, I think that the community of machine learning has a plethora of solutions that I think are ready for it. The question is, I understand your point about multiple endpoints and competing risks potentially. And do you think, though, in order for such technologies to be useful in practice, will one need to run a clinical trial, or how would one demonstrate that such interventions where you would move from a one-size-fits-all monitoring to a personalized monitoring would be useful? Will that require backup with a trial or not?
So you're going to have to convince people to use it. So it will require some sort of staged intervention or implementation, but you could easily see how that might work. So if an active sensing model suggested that I could see my patients every 6 months instead of every 4 or 3, that would make a huge impact across a clinic very quickly in terms of resource allocation and expense for our healthcare system. That could be implemented in a stage-wise fashion. You make the prediction and I see them earlier, or I see them when I was going to see them anyway, and that would allow me to see what the impact would have been if I did what the active sensing model suggested. So at 0 risk, you could see with a more frequent follow-up what the consequences would be, and then that would give you sufficient context. So that's effectively a staged trial of sorts. But I think that would be necessary rather than jumping straight to implementation.
Yeah, I would agree that you do some kind of a you could randomize patients to get it and not, and then see what happens both for your work effort and patient outcomes over time, like, and particularly maybe around like control of diabetes or control of a chronic disease, something like that. You could I think would be a key first step to doing that. I think another thing that we get a lot in the US healthcare system is not only the time, which tends to be kind of just based on habit and what other people are doing in your market. In Dartmouth, they showed that when you have more competitive, when you have more providers per capita, the time between visits shortens because they're trying to fill their schedule up. Because in the US, a filled schedule is income, right? So you're trying to maintain that. So they shorten their duration or their interval in competitive environments. But I think an additional thing that would be maybe a next step after what you suggest is finding the amount of time that patients have with a provider, right? Because hypothetically, people should be operating at the top of their license. And if you have a complex patient, it might reasonably take you 40 minutes and they need to be seen more frequently than someone who's just generally healthy. And the example we would always use at Dartmouth, I think, is that if in the Swedish healthcare system, if you had hypertension and it was well controlled on meds, they would say, come back when you have another problem. So you wouldn't have a follow-up even scheduled necessarily. So I think it very much depends. A lot of it is cultural and what people are kind of used to experiencing, including patients who might feel that they're being neglected if they aren't seen every 3 months or whatever. But I think there's huge opportunity, as you point out, to allocate resources much more efficiently for patients and among providers and different provider levels, frankly, too, right? Mid-level providers versus physicians to optimize the use of those scarce resources as well.
Thank you so much. Fergus?
Thanks, Eoin. Thanks, Bill. Bill, I'm going to jump to something you said a little earlier about human, like the kind of clinician decision making and forming this kind of team with the patient. Because we have a question from one of our audience members, almost about clinicians and the AI kind of models forming teams and how they should interact. So, Divyanesh, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Maybe you want to unmute and ask your question around this.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I want to understand trust and reliability of AI models in real time. And are patients notified when AI is suggesting treatments, or patient trust doctor's intuition more than any treatment suggested by AI? I mean, the trust and reliability of AI models when it comes to real-time diagnosis.
So I guess if we prize those apart a bit, the idea of trust in models, you can either consider whether a physician trusts the answer that an algorithm gives him, or whether a patient trusts the information depending on its source. And somewhat depressingly, from my perspective, both patients and other physicians tend to trust an algorithm-generated result more than they trust it from an individual. However, the trust goes up substantially where that is interpretable. In other words, when you can provide an explanation of why alongside a result, the trust and reliability goes up hugely in terms of the acceptability of that result. But it's worth also considering that in terms of whether something is sufficiently trustworthy to be acceptable, because many regulations now require a degree of interpretability for adoption as well. So if that answers your question, partly perhaps.
Yes, sure, sir.
I would maybe add that I think one of the realities of healthcare that people who don't study the actual healthcare systems a lot may miss is that there is very wide variation in quality of care provided among providers. And it depends, even someone who is in the same hall, sharing the same hall and the same receptionist or whatever, might have very different kind of quality that they do as far as adherence to guidelines and things like that. And while there's been a lot of progress in integrating the guideline suggestions into electronic medical records, they aren't individualized. The guidelines tend to be developed for people who look a lot like me, who have white hair and are male and white. That's how they've been developed. So they may not actually apply necessarily ideally to the patient in front of you. So, I mean, what I hope is that I think the AI algorithms, again, with that objectivity and incorporating some patient characteristics into the recommendations to follow with interpretable AI, can actually shorten that gap or reduce that quality gap that you get when a patient goes to a provider. I mean, think about the way that you pick a provider. You're generally kind of just assigned, or someone thinks the guy's a nice guy or something like that. The quality metrics aren't necessarily available. And even though they've been repeatedly studied and produced in the US, and the King's Fund has done this in the UK repeatedly, where you see this variation, it doesn't tend to make much of a difference as to where patients go. So my hope is that we could use AI to kind of reduce that gap of quality so that all patients will get a much better kind of experience, or at least have the chance to have a better quality experience or experience of quality care when they go to any provider.
So thank you so much for both your question and then those two fantastic answers. I think we've got time for one more comment or question before we wrap up. And I saw Duncan Simpson had put a comment, I think, for Sam in the Slack chat. So Duncan, do you want to ask or provide your comment to Sam?
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's great to have an opportunity to. So background on me, I'm a research partnerships manager rather than a particular expert in things. So I tend to sit back and just try to observe and try and absorb as much of the information as I can. But here I just found there was so many things that Sam was saying that chimed with projects that we're dealing with here in Canon Medical that I wanted to put a comment in. Well, the first was on that idea of, ideally you want that continuous monitoring, the patient monitoring. And we're doing a study on colorectal cancer patients with a clinical group in Glasgow. And one of the real challenges we have is that the measurements are very discrete. And so trying to understand from that, the time point of the meaning of that measurement is a real challenge. So absolutely sort of interested to see you're sort of coming up from the other angle, but then also the understanding of the whole purpose of this project that we're doing is to then infer the correct and most useful monitoring of patients in the future. So they're at risk of colorectal cancer. They've had a colonoscopy to remove polyps, which are early stage cancers. And the question is, how often should they then have a colonoscopy to keep monitoring them? And it's not a question of the cost of the procedure. It does have a cost. It's more that it's a limited resource and there's a big waiting list for colonoscopies. So it's when do you bring this patient back in rather than seeing somebody else, because you could do it as part of the scanning. And you can see, we're kind of medically, you can see this as being a much wider question of it comes in all sorts of things. You could have an MR scanning procedure. You could have all sorts of early diagnosis, community diagnosis initiatives that would be incredibly beneficial. The health economics of them would definitely be beneficial, except that it's an expensive and scarce resource. So actually, where is the best time to monitor it? So I just wanted to throw the comment in and say it's an incredibly valid. We're working with real clinical data, and we see the messiness of it that you were talking about. And the challenge of it, but we also see that these really are the key questions that we're working on. So it was really exciting to get that same question being looked at from a different point of view. I know there's others on the call that could go into more technical detail on those particular projects, but I don't want to do that. I just wanted to say this is so relevant, this is so needed. So it was great to see the presentation. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that comment, Duncan. I'm sure Sam appreciates it. And it's also super exciting when there's a good match between some of these maybe more theoretical, methodological discussions in it and real world problems that are being addressed. And I think maybe that's a fantastic note to end this portion of the session on. So with that, I think I'd just really like to thank our two guests, Professor Eoin McKinney and Dr. Bill Weeks, for their time today and for participating in the panel. I found it super interesting, and so I hope everybody else has as well. I'm just going to remind everybody and let everyone know that our next session is going to be on the 8th of January, and we're going to cover two topics of a more methodological nature in double descent and ensemble learning. And this session will be out today on YouTube soon. So until then, have a great rest of the year, everybody, and we will see you in the new year. Thank you very much.